It's the last day of May 2014, late afternoon in the Chatham neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, and everything looks the way it always looks on a warm Saturday. Kids are bouncing between storefronts. Somebody's bass-heavy stereo spills out of a cracked window 2 floors up. An ice cream truck works its way slowly up the block, bell going, oblivious to everything around it. The air smells like cut grass and exhaust, and the sun is still bright enough to make you squint if you look west. Nothing about this afternoon looks different from any other Saturday on the South Side. That's the thing about days like this. They never do. MacArthur Swindle sits in the driver's seat of his white SUV, parked in a strip mall lot along the 700 block of East 87th Street. At 21, he's in a good mood, fresh off buying new clothes for a music video he's been planning. He goes by OTF Noo-Noo, and over the past year he's been steadily building his name, riding the momentum his cousin Lil Durk is beginning to generate on a national level. Durk has just signed to Def Jam. His name is getting louder, pulling attention with it, and Noo-Noo, right here, on this quiet Saturday afternoon, is part of that rise. Just after finishing a phone call, surveillance footage later described by police captures a man approaching the vehicle on foot at around 3:20 in the afternoon, moving without urgency, without hesitation, with the kind of steady, deliberate pace that suggests either experience or a level of preparation where fear no longer plays a role. He closes the distance, pauses briefly, scans the area once, then raises a gun and fires multiple shots through the driver's window at close range. The impact is immediate. Noo-Noo's body absorbs the shots as his foot presses down on the accelerator, and the SUV surges forward, jumping the curb before crashing straight through the plate glass window of a nearby clothing store. Inside, everything fractures at once. Shoppers dive to the floor, someone screams, and shattered glass bursts inward, scattering across racks of jackets and the tiled floor, while outside people break into a run, one woman dropping her shopping bag without ever turning back. By the time police arrive and begin sealing off the block, MacArthur OTF Noo-Noo Swindle is pronounced dead at 3:25 p.m., while the shooter is already gone, having slipped into an alley and disappeared into the surrounding neighborhood as if he was never there. Responding officers would later note the calm precision of the attack, the absence of panic, the unmistakable sense that whoever carried it out was not new to violence, but familiar with it. In the aftermath, Noo-Noo's family pushes back hard against the narrative forming around his death, with his aunt going on record to insist he had no involvement in street activity, describing him instead as an aspiring rapper with plans, someone focused on building a future rather than entangled in the kind of life that leads to this. The police, however, classify the killing as gang-related, and like so many cases tied to that world, it stalls without resolution. Then, less than an hour after the news begins to circulate, before the scene has even fully settled, a Twitter account posts a string of laughing emojis with no caption, no context, and no explanation, yet timed in a way that feels deliberate enough for anyone paying attention to read between the lines. The account belongs to a man named Yarmel Williams, though that name rarely comes up in conversation. On the streets and across social media, he is known as Melly, more specifically, 051 Melly. And in the hours and days that follow, his name begins to move, spreading through tweets, private messages, and word of mouth the way a lit match moves through dry grass, fast, uncontrollable, and leaving something altered in its wake. No charges are filed, no direct proof surfaces, but in Chicago's drill-era landscape, perception has always carried its own weight, and the rumor alone is enough to set the next chain of events in motion. This is his story. To understand what Melly would become, you have to go back further than 2014. You have to go back to a building, the Calumet Building, also known as Randolph Towers, or just the Met, to the people who lived there, sat at 6217 South Calumet Avenue, and for most of the 1990s and early 2000s, it was one of the most controlled pieces of real estate on Chicago's South Side, and not by the Chicago Housing Authority. The Black disciples had effectively commandeered the structure. Federal prosecutors who eventually brought indictments against the leadership described a corporate-style drug operation that moved somewhere in the neighborhood of $300,000 worth of heroin and crack cocaine per day. Dealers worked rotations. Security teams frisked visitors at the entrance and required identification even from residents who lived there. Members of the gang posted themselves on the roof with sniper rifles and night vision goggles. The building was known internally as the Castle, which tells you everything you need to know about how the people running it understood their own power. For a child growing up inside those walls, violence wasn't a distant possibility. It was the architecture of daily life. It filled the hallways outside your front door. It shaped which routes you took to school and which ones you didn't. which staircases you used, and which ones you avoided after a certain hour. It was the background noise against which everything else in your childhood played out. Yarmel Williams was born in 1991 and grew up here. His mother Angie raised him and his siblings in this building. His stepfather, Jerome Frito Golden, was a Black Disciples member who received a life sentence in 1994 for a quadruple murder when Melly was still a toddler. His biological father was absent. His uncle G Slim was one of the founders of a gang set called No Limit, which had heritage in the Black P Stones and would later produce rappers like G Herbo and Lil Baby. Another uncle, Kurt Mack, was a well-known figure in the DRO city area of Woodlawn, the same neighborhood that produced Pac-Man, often credited as one of the original architects of drill music. Melly even had a family connection to the rapper Bump J, one of Chicago's most prominent pre-drill gangster rappers, who repped the Four Corner Hustlers. Gangs weren't something Melly encountered from the outside. They were woven through his family like thread through fabric, present before he was born, present in the relatives he looked up to, present in every decision the adults around him made. He wasn't recruited into this world at some point in his teenage years. He was born inside it. The building was demolished in 2006 as part of Chicago's program to tear down its major housing projects, scattering communities across the South Side like seeds from a broken pod. After the demolition, Melly's family relocated to an address near 59th and Calumet, which was squarely inside the territory of a set called 600, a group that would eventually become his worst enemies. His brother Wu would later recall in an interview that living there felt like being in enemy territory from the jump. The animosity was quiet at first, operating underneath a surface of uneasy coexistence, but it was there, and everybody could feel it. We wasn't like into it, Wu said, but mothers had secret animosity. Eventually, Melly's loyalties drifted toward the other side of Washington Park, toward a crew that hung around 51st Street and identified primarily as Mickey Cobras, with overlapping connections to both the gangster disciples and fragments of the Black disciples. This set was called 051 Young Money. The 051 referred to the 51st Street corridor. Mel came from Yarmel, softened into Melly, a nickname that carried a playful, almost gentle sound that would eventually become one of the most feared names in the city. The founding members of 051 Young Money, including a young man named Isaiah Walker, known as Zico, often credited as the set's main founder, were all killed in 2008. Melly was approximately 16 or 17 years old when those deaths happened back to back. Zico in particular was murdered by a member of a rival set called THF 46, and the loss would reportedly redefine something fundamental in how Melly operated from that point forward. 3 people close to you, dead inside a single year, before drill culture had even begun to accelerate the violence, before social media had given any of it an audience, having to carry that kind of grief in an environment that had no language for processing it, no infrastructure for healing it, no support systems designed to catch a teenage boy in freefall. It doesn't just change you. According to people who knew him, it hardened him into something that didn't have much softness left. He stopped going to DuSable High School not long after, and then the decade started. Before Melly's name attached itself to anything involving Lil Durk, the war between 051 and the constellation of BD-affiliated sets around them had already been running for years, trading bodies across Washington Park, accumulating losses, building a debt that neither side had any mechanism for settling. But if you want to identify the specific ignition point for the sequence of events that would eventually pull Durk's family directly into the crossfire, you need to start in March of 2014 with a bus stop on 51st Street and a young man who made the mistake of recording a diss track that made him the most wanted person in Chicago's streets overnight. Mark Campbell went by Lil Mark, and he was 20 years old, a 051 Young Money member and aspiring rapper who had been building momentum in Chicago's underground drill scene. In the days immediately before he was killed, Lil Mark dropped a song called No Competition, a direct remix of a Lil Durk record, repurposed as an explicit diss aimed at Durk, at his crew OTF, at the 600 set, at O Block, at Lamron, a comprehensive public challenge to the most dangerous people in his orbit, delivered on a song with Durk's production underneath it, under Durk's own song title. The kind of move that turns you into a target before the upload even finishes processing. On March 28, 2014, Lil Mark was standing at a bus shelter near 300 East 51st Street in the middle of the afternoon in broad daylight when someone approached him and shot him once in the head. He died at the scene. No one was ever charged. The reaction was immediate, and by this era's standards, typical in the worst way. D Rose from 600 was online claiming it almost immediately. King Von from O Block was celebrating. And then Lil Durk, whose song Mark had remixed just before dying, made a move that people in online circles still reference as a turning point. Durk filmed himself standing at the exact bus stop where Lil Mark had been killed and posted it, looking at the camera, telling people it was a real famous place, with a caption directing his audience to free THF Beju, a THF 46 member. He was standing at a murder scene, days after the body was removed, making it content. In the context of how this war operated, that video was a provocation. Durk was already a nationally touring artist by this point, largely insulated by fame and distance from the streets he came up in. Hard to reach, hard to hit, but the people around him weren't. The people who were still in Chicago, still reachable, still sleeping in these neighborhoods, they were accessible. And according to the narrative that developed in the months that followed, Melly saw that video and understood it as a declaration that everything connected to Durk was a valid target, starting with whoever was still close enough to touch. 2 months later, 87th Street, Noo-Noo, dead in his SUV. The domino had fallen, and everything after it was a consequence of that first push. Here is how retaliation actually works in environments like this, because understanding the mechanics is the only way to understand how a single name can accumulate the weight that Melly's eventually did. It isn't one for one. It isn't clean and proportional and logical. It operates on a debt system where the principal never fully settles and the interest compounds with every new event. Someone on your side dies and the debt doesn't disappear when you respond to it. Your response creates a new debt on the other side, which creates a new obligation on your side, which produces the next funeral, which starts the cycle again. There is no end state built into the logic. There is only continuation. To understand how deep the chain ran before Noo-Noo, before it ever touched Durk's family directly, you have to go back to February of 2012 and a young man named Shaquille Rush, known as Shock, who was loosely affiliated with 600's neighborhood, though apparently not deeply involved in its violence. On the night in question, Shock had been at a party in 600's turf, where, according to later accounts, a photo was taken of him making the 051 hand sign in a way that 051 members read as disrespect. Later that night, walking through an alley on the 5900 block of South Calumet Avenue, he was shot once in the upper back. He made it to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He didn't survive. What makes this incident significant in the context of Melly's story isn't just the death itself, it's what happened afterward. For years following Shaq's murder, Melly taunted 600 members about it constantly and specifically, referencing the circumstances of the shooting, mocking the location, making it a running piece of psychological warfare that he deployed in online arguments and on social media. Whether he was the actual shooter is disputed. A 600 veteran named Taponi has said publicly that Melly wasn't responsible, but the taunting was undeniable and deliberate, and 600 responded to it as though he was. Within a few months of Shaq's death, 051 paid a price. A 14-year-old named Antonio Davis, known as Fathead, the youngest member of the set, was walking to a store with his cousin in Inglewood when someone shot him multiple times while standing over him. He died at the scene. Chicago police later named several people from 600 and Lamron as suspects, including a member named Marvin Riley, identified as the alleged trigger man based on the cousin's description. 14 years old, that number sits in the middle of this story like a stone. By the time 051 allegedly responded to Fathead's death, and multiple attributed killings followed over the next year, including the murder of 600 affiliated rapper L.A. Capone in September 2013, with two 051 members eventually convicted for that one. The infrastructure of the war was fully established. It had its own history, its own martyrs, its own ledger of debts that everyone in the community was expected to carry. Then Lil Mark died in March 2014. Then Noo-Noo died in May 2014. And then less than 10 months after Noo-Noo, the war took another member of Durk's inner circle in a way that made the targeting feel impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Uchenna Agena had been Lil Durk's road manager since before the record deal. He went by OTF Chino, and he'd been in Durk's corner through the whole early climb, booking shows, running logistics, building the infrastructure around a career that was genuinely starting to take off. On the night of March 26th into the early morning hours of March 27th, 2015, Chino had come from a meeting with NBA player Joakim Noah. They were working together on an anti-violence initiative, which carries a particular weight given what was about to happen, and ended up sitting in his car outside a fast food restaurant on the 8400 block of Stony Island Avenue, just parked. probably scrolling his phone in the middle of a night that should have been ordinary. Hours earlier, Lil Durk had released a remix of Chief Keef's Finito that included a line about riding down on Young Money and spraying 30 rounds, an explicit public documented threat against 051, put on record by a major label rapper and distributed nationwide, released into the atmosphere, and then, hours later, Chino was dead. An unknown gunman walked up to his car and fired through the windshield. He was taken to Advocate Trinity Hospital and pronounced dead at 2:04 in the morning. Police had no suspects in custody. The fader confirmed he was shot while sitting in a car outside the restaurant, and Durk's team did not respond to a request for comment. Mubu Crump, a rapper, an internet figure aligned with King Louie's Moo Crew, who by this point had become one of Melly's most prominent outside allies, filmed himself at the murder scene the next day. He went to the counter of the restaurant and asked if they had an order for Nooski. He called out for a Chino burger. He stood at the place where Durk's manager had been killed and made it into content, trolling Lil Durk by name, dissing his dead cousin and his dead manager simultaneously, doing it on camera, publicly, apparently convinced that no consequence would find him for it. That video circulated everywhere. It was vicious and deliberate and completely consistent with how this particular era of Chicago gang conflict operated. The killing and the taunting as a single integrated act, the social media post as the finishing blow, the documentation as the statement. Chicago Magazine would later note that Chino's death appeared directly connected to the escalating war between Durk and his rivals. Once again, no charges. Once again, Melly's name spread through every street conversation and online thread as the architect, with nothing provable attached to it. And with every cycle that ran this way, violence followed by taunting, followed by silence from investigators, the legend grew. Not because it was confirmed, but because it was never denied by the one person who could have. By somewhere around 2015 and 2016, something had happened to Melly's reputation that went beyond anything that could be explained by specific incidents or specific kills. His name had become a concept, a shorthand, a way of describing a particular category of threat. He never released music. This is one of the most unusual aspects of his entire story, because in this era, in this city, music was how people built names. Chief Keef built his on YouTube. King Von built his on YouTube. Lil Durk built his on mixtapes and eventually on Def Jam. The pipeline from street credibility to rap career was so established that it was almost automatic. If you were known in the neighborhood, you made music, you documented it, you got on camera, and performed your reality back at the people who created it with you. Melly never did any of that. His name circulated purely through fear and through the testimony of others, through the rappers who referenced him in songs, the bloggers who attached his name to unsolved shootings, the enemies who dissed him online, and the allies who bragged about him in comment sections, and through the specific social media behavior. The taunting, the laughing emojis, the vague posts that seemed to celebrate events no one had publicly connected him to yet, that made him feel omnipresent without ever being fully visible. The nickname the Gravedigger emerged gradually across Chicago's drill media landscape during this period, sometimes extended to the Chirac Gravedigger as a reference to his neighborhood and territory. YouTube channels ran timelines of unsolved shootings and placed his name in the frame of each one. Hood blogs compiled what they described as his body count, numbers that ranged from 15 confirmed murders to involvement in over 40 separate incidents across multiple overlapping gang wars. None of these numbers appear in any court record. None of them are verified by any law enforcement source. What they represent is the architectures of a legend, constructed from circumstantial evidence, social media inference, and the specific phenomenon of someone being repeatedly accused and never arrested. And that last part, the never being arrested, may be the most important element of the entire mythology. Because you can't charge a rumor, you can't convict a ghost. And in a subculture that measured power through survival above all else, a man who was openly named in the deaths of multiple high-profile figures and was still walking free, still appearing in Instagram photos smiling with gold teeth in contested territory, still posting on Twitter without apparent concern, that man becomes something the streets don't have normal language for. Police in this era had even begun treating YouTube comment sections and Twitter threads as crime scenes, trying to monitor the real-time documentation of violence that these platforms had made possible, which only accelerated the incentive to perform on them. Photos circulated of him in 600 territory, in O-Block's radius, moving through spaces that should have been lethal to walk through if even half the stories about him were true. He was visible in a way that people in his alleged position simply weren't. And that visibility wasn't accidental or careless. It was a message. I am not afraid of you. I am here. Come do something about it. Rappers from multiple sets referenced him, some threatening him, some celebrating him, some both in the same verse. King Von, in his most famous song Back Again, released in the final stretch of 2019, apparently referenced Melly's death with something approaching joy. A rapper with his own alleged 7 bodies celebrating the death of the man many considered Chicago's original serial killer, the one who had come before the rap era, made that kind of notoriety crossover into streaming numbers. The comparison between Von and Melly circulated constantly in certain corners of Chicago's internet. Von had music, had a deal, had an audience that extended beyond the South Side. Melly had none of that. He had only the streets, and the streets were enough. Whether the perception matched the reality, whether he actually had the body count attributed to him, or whether some portion of it was myth built up and maintained because myth is useful in warfare, is something no court has ever resolved. It likely never will be. What it produced in real time was fear that had operational effects. People moved differently around him. Alliances formed and broke based on proximity to him. Rivals factored him into strategic decisions. In a city where that kind of psychological weight could keep you alive or get you killed depending on which side of it you stood on, his reputation was as real as anything documented on paper. The most disturbing dimension of Melly's alleged operation wasn't the violence directed outward. It was the violence that turned inward, and the specific documented incident that sits at the center of that story is the alleged murder of Lord Dre in 2017. Dondre Smith, known as Lord Dre, was 22 years old and, according to investigators, a friend of Melly's. Not an enemy, not a rival from a different set, someone in his orbit, someone he knew. On June 13th, 2017, residents in the 5000 block of Drexel Boulevard reported gunshots. In a building's gangway, police found Lord Dre's body, shot multiple times. He was dead at the scene. When investigators began building the case, the picture that emerged was methodical and cold-blooded in a way that the retaliation killings weren't. According to what they eventually pieced together, Melly had allegedly invited Dre out that night with a cover story about a robbery. A drug dealer they were going to hit together, a quick opportunity. But Dre, who knew Melly well enough that some part of him registered the risk even before he agreed to go, allegedly texted his brother before leaving, let him know he was with Melly in case something happened. That text existed. That moment of quiet, private dread existed, and it wasn't enough to save him. The motive, according to investigators, was money, specifically $12,000. There was allegedly a bounty on Lord Dre's head placed by someone on the other side of one of Melly's ongoing conflicts, and Melly allegedly needed cash to bond his brother Wu out of jail. Wu had been arrested on weapons charges 2 days earlier. The allegation is this: Melly lured his own friend to that gangway on Drexel Boulevard under false pretenses, killed him to collect a bounty, and used that money to get his brother out of a cell. Investigators reportedly obtained jail call recordings between Melly and Wu that they believe contained poorly disguised coded references to the murder plot. A witness told police that Melly had tried to frame the situation to her as both himself and Dre having money on their heads, suggesting it was inevitable that one would eventually collect on the other. It reads like someone managing the narrative of a murder they'd already decided to commit. Police didn't have enough to charge him at the time. By the time they did, it was already too late for reasons that would become clear in 2019. There are other stories in this territory. The alleged shooting of a 051 affiliated man named Lil Daryl, whose real name was Daryl Rye, that investigators would later identify as a key factor in what ultimately got Melly killed. The persistent online rumors about internal disputes with other 051 members. The general understanding, which seems to have been widely shared by people in his circle, that proximity to Melly came with a specific kind of risk that didn't exist around other people. Dre had texted his brother before going. He knew, and he went anyway. That detail contains the whole story of what it was like to move in Melly's world. You understood the danger, you couldn't always avoid it, and sometimes the person most likely to hurt you was the one you'd known the longest. By 2018, there was a specific window of time where Melly's alleged operation was running at something like maximum velocity, and the contradiction at the center of it was becoming impossible to ignore. He was more visible and more active than he had ever been, while simultaneously accumulating enemies at a rate that no amount of tactical skill could indefinitely outrun. In May of 2018, Boo Crump, the man who had filmed himself at Noo-Noo's murder scene, who had produced the Chino burger video, who had been Melly's most prominent outside ally, and the most aggressive online face of the anti-Durk campaign, was shot and killed outside a party on the 6,800 block of South Morgan Street. He and Melly had apparently both been at the gathering when a car drove by and opened fire. Crump took the bullets. Melly, according to the police report, was not the second victim, though the circumstances were murky enough that the rumors swirled immediately. And Melly's own denial on a subsequent Instagram Live was notably evasive. "I was in a bush," he said, which landed with the credibility you'd expect. The people online immediately connected Crump's murder to Lil Durk's circle. Whether or not that's what happened, it created a new debt for Melly. And given what had come before, no one in Chicago expected that debt to go unpaid. In August 2018, Tyrone Marshall, a young man known as Ty, who had allegedly been present during the murder of Bankroll Q, one of Melly's 051 affiliates, and who was close to Lil Del, another person Melly was connected to in street rumor, was sitting in a car on the 4,000 block of South Calumet Avenue when someone drove up and shot him in the head. He died at the hospital. A witness apparently recognized Melly as the shooter. Police couldn't move quickly enough. And then in October of 2018, in the parking lot of a McDonald's in the Pullman neighborhood, 3 men were shot from a car that pulled up in the early morning hours. One of them was Lil Durk's brother Dathong, who survived. One of them was Durk's cousin, Baby D, Darnell Banks, who died hours later at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Online, the trail of circumstantial evidence that people connected to Melly was longer and more explicit than almost any other killing attributed to him. A photo of Baby D's relatives wearing memorial shirts with F. Melly printed boldly across the front, implying clear belief about who was responsible. After Melly's death in 2019, Dathong's social media posts seemed to celebrate it directly, and he tweeted that no op who had ever shot at him was alive anymore to tell the story about it. These aren't charges. They're not admissible anywhere, but in the language that this world uses to say what it knows and can't prove, they are about as explicit as it gets. Through all of this, in the same period, Melly sat down for an Instagram Live with THF Beasu, technically from the opposing side of this feud, but someone with whom he maintained a complicated ongoing relationship, and said he was never leaving Chicago, that he was going to make it to 100 years old. Beasu nodded and credited him for knowing how to move. "I know how to move," Melly said. And for a moment, watching it, you could almost believe him, but knowing how to move only matters if you can accurately identify who's trying to move on you. And Melly, by this point, had created so many enemies in so many directions. Enemies who came from sets he'd been at war with for a decade. Enemies who used to be his allies. Enemies who lived inside his own orbit, that the map of danger had become impossible to fully read. January 3rd, 2019. Melly's closest friend on the streets at this point, a man named Wilbert Morris, known as Motor, from a set called Jarrow City that had become closely allied with 051 Young Money, was riding in a car with a friend named Marcus Clark, known as Side, on the 5,000 block of South Indiana Avenue in Bronzeville. Just before 1 in the afternoon, someone opened fire. Both Motor and Side were hit. Both were killed at the scene. Motor was one of Melly's genuine relationships, not just a tactical alliance. People who knew them both described it that way, as actual closeness, in a world where actual closeness was rare and dangerous. Losing him hit differently than losing a crew member lost in the ordinary rhythm of war. Melly reportedly swore on everything he had that whoever was responsible would cry the way he was crying. But he had also, by now, created the specific circumstance that would make keeping that vow impossible. The issue was Lil Darryl. Darryl Rye was a Jarrow City member, technically on Melly's side of the map, from a set that 051 Young Money had moved closely with for years. But investigators would later reveal that Melly had allegedly shot up Darryl's house, apparently convinced that Darryl had been cooperating with investigators on the Lord Dre murder case. The paranoia that had reportedly made him turn on Lord Dre in the first place had now turned outward into a set he was supposed to be allied with, and shattered the relationship with a single violent act. Lil Darryl had friends who hadn't forgotten about it. Labor Day weekend, August 31st into September 1st, 2019. The South Side comes alive on this weekend the way it only does in late summer. Barbecues running long, block parties bleeding into house parties, bleeding into gatherings that keep going until the sun comes back up. The party Melly attended that night was in Jarrow City territory on the 6,100 block of South St. Lawrence Avenue. He would have known the faces there. He would have felt the specific relaxation that comes from being in a place where you've always been comfortable, where the people around you have always been yours. Except one of them was Darryl's friend, a man known as 007 Nate, and someone inside that house was filming on their phone in the minutes before shots rang out. catching what would turn out to be the final documented footage of Melly alive, in a confrontation that the video makes visible without fully decoding. At approximately 3:50 in the morning, gunfire erupted inside the house. Melly was hit in the chest, the abdomen, and the groin. Multiple wounds, the kind that don't leave much runway. A 34-year-old woman at the party was also shot. Both were rushed to University of Chicago Hospital. The woman survived. Melly did not. Yarmel O51 Melly Williams was pronounced dead at 27, his life ending in a case that would carry as many questions as it did silence. Witnesses at the scene refused to give police anything. No descriptions, no direction, nothing that could point to who pulled the trigger. And with nothing to work from, no one was ever charged, the department later classifying the shooting as an isolated incident. But long before any official statement settled in before sunrise on September 1st, 2019, the verdict had already been written elsewhere. Across every feed connected to Chicago's drill ecosystem, the same phrase began circulating with quiet certainty: Melly got backdoored. Because the name Melly didn't exist in isolation, it carried a history, a weight built on stories and allegations that had followed him for years. This was a man people said had killed a friend over a $12,000 bounty, a man rumored to have opened fire on a Jarrow City member's home over suspected betrayal, someone whose reputation rested on the belief that he could read danger before it revealed itself, that he understood how to move, how to survive, how to outthink the double cross before it ever formed. He was supposed to make it to 100. And yet in the end, that same man walked into a party in territory he considered safe, surrounded by faces that were familiar, by an environment that should have required the least amount of caution, only to be killed by someone who had been within his orbit the entire time, close enough to watch, to wait, and to choose the exact moment when his guard would be lowest. The hunter became the hunted, the one who had built his name around anticipating betrayal, ultimately overtaken by it, not at the hands of distant enemies, but from within a circle shaped by the very paranoia his alleged actions had helped create, turning what once felt like safe ground into the place where everything finally caught up to him. By morning, social media had processed Melly's death the way it processed everything in this era, with speed, with cruelty, with the specific emotional register of a community that had learned to perform both grief and celebration on the same platform at the same time. On one side, tributes flooded in from O51 affiliates, and from the broader community of people who had watched his legend build for years. Photos with angel wings, the ritual language of mourning that Chicago streets had developed their own specific grammar for. On the other side, the celebration was exactly what you'd expect from people who had been on the wrong end of his alleged activity for the better part of a decade. Within days, shootings erupted in neighborhoods connected to O51 and the sets they'd been at war with. Whether they were direct retaliations or simply the ongoing rhythm of violence that would have happened regardless, that distinction is impossible to make cleanly. What's clear is that nothing stopped. No peace broke out. No cycle ended. The machine kept running because it was never about any one individual. It was about territory and history and a debt system with no mechanism for permanent settlement. The case that most explicitly illustrates what nothing ended actually means is the murder of Carlton Weekly, FBG Duck, in August of 2020, nearly a year after Melly died. Duck was a GD-affiliated rapper from the Tookaville faction who had been at open war with O-Block for years, whose brother FBG Brick and cousin Kobe Mack had been gunned down in Woodlawn back in 2017 in a double murder that street narrative had connected to the ongoing feud. On August 4th, 2020, Duck was shopping on East Oak Street in Chicago's Gold Coast, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, miles from the south side geography of this entire war, when 4 gunmen jumped out of 2 vehicles and opened fire in broad daylight. Duck was killed. 2 bystanders were wounded. Federal prosecutors brought indictments. In January 2024, a federal jury convicted 6 men connected to O-Block murder and conspiracy to commit murder in aid of racketeering in connection with Duck's death. During that trial, prosecutors introduced music videos, social media posts, Instagram stories, and Twitter threads as evidence, the full documented record of a generation of public violence that had always been conducted partly online, partly in the open, by people who understood they were being watched and continued anyway. The FBG Duck trial confirmed in federal court what everyone in Chicago had already understood for years, that the social media dimension of this war wasn't a sideshow. It was the war. It was how the war was organized, communicated, and claimed. As for Lil Durk himself, the man whose family and inner circle bore a disproportionate amount of the specific violence this story traces, the losses did not stop when Melly died. He lost King Von in November 2020 outside an Atlanta nightclub after a confrontation that escalated into a shooting. He lost his brother Dethong in June 2021, shot in Chicago. The man who built his entire artistic identity around the phrase "only the family" has buried more family than most people encounter in an entire lifetime. And the count accumulated in ways that have nothing to do with Melly and everything to do with the world Melly was a part of. Here is the truth that sits underneath all of this, and it's the truth that gets most easily obscured when this story gets told as pure spectacle, as entertainment, as a body count breakdown, as a recitation of names and dates that can be made to feel exciting if you arrange them correctly. Yarmel Williams was not born the Gravedigger. He was born inside a public housing complex where the Black disciples ran a $300,000 per day drug empire and posted snipers on the rooftop. His stepfather received a life sentence for quadruple murder when Melly was a toddler. 3 of the founding members of his eventual crew were dead before he graduated high school. His first genuine loyalty, to a friend named Zico, ended with Zico's murder when Melly was 17, in a killing that was eventually solved, but not before it had already done its work on the boy who survived it. He watched his neighborhood get demolished and his community scattered. He was surrounded by violence before he was old enough to make any meaningful choice about whether to participate in it. None of that is an excuse. The people who allegedly died at his hands or at the hands of people operating in the climate he helped create were real. They had names and families and plans. Noo-Noo was buying clothes for a music video. Chino had been at an anti-violence meeting the same night he was killed. Lord Dre texted his brother before going to meet Melly because some part of him knew and went anyway and didn't come back. A 34-year-old woman was shot at the party where Melly died, and her name barely surfaces in any account of that night because the machine that produces these stories doesn't see bystanders as protagonists. But the framing that treats Melly as simply a monster, as a uniquely evil individual whose violence emerged from some personal darkness rather than from a specific documented, policy-created set of conditions, flattens a more important and more actionable truth. The same story plays out simultaneously across the South Side, in dozens of sets, across multiple generations. The names change, the addresses change, the structure of the story doesn't. Researchers studying Chicago's gang dynamics during this period noted that social media didn't create the violence, but it accelerated it by making everything public, by rewarding visibility and taunting, by building audiences for behavior that had always existed but had never before had a stadium. Former gang leader Hal Baskin told reporters that modern Chicago gangs operated as self-governing cliques without centralized leadership or accountability, where personal slights and social media insults moved directly into real-world violence without the friction that older organizational structures had sometimes provided. Sociologist Forrest Stewart, who embedded with Chicago gangs during this era, documented how YouTube's economy actively encouraged the posting of violent content, and how teens navigated an environment where performing toughness online could get you killed, and performing it anyway was sometimes the only way to survive socially. Researchers studying Chicago youth in this period found that over 56% of local teenagers reported regularly hearing gunshots, and 21% had witnessed someone being attacked with a weapon. Melly grew up in a building where the gang ran everything. He lost his founding crew at 17. He watched his neighborhood get demolished and his community scatter across the South Side that was simultaneously fracturing into hundreds of leaderless microsets, each one fighting for intersections and Instagram followers with semi-automatic weapons that had become easier to acquire than the support systems that might have redirected any of it. What he became was, in some ways, the most complete product that specific environment was capable of producing. He never tried to cross over into music. He never tried to monetize the legend. He never attempted to build anything beyond the reputation itself. He simply built the most feared name he could, in the only world he was ever given access to, using the only tools that world made available, until the paranoia that the legend required consumed the last people around him who might have seen it coming. And then he died in a house he thought was safe, surrounded by people he thought were his, on a South Side street at 3:50 in the morning, in a city that has been producing this story in different variations since long before he was born, and will continue producing it long after every version of his name fades from social media memory. The cycle does not mourn its participants. It simply continues and inserts new names and runs again. In Chicago, it always runs again.